Hi everyone, welcome to this first segment of Interview with the Faculty. My name is Julie Chantal and I'm going to be your host today. So today it's my pleasure to talk with Dr. Christopher Hendricks, who teaches at the Armstrong campus of Georgia Southern University. Hi Dr. Hendricks, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
So today we're going to talk about his second book called The Old Southern Cookery, Mary Randolph's Recipes for America's First Regional Cookbook, adapted for today's kitchen. So, Dr. Hendricks, can you tell us a little bit more about that project? Your book just came out on May 1st, 2020. It's still fresh off the press. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure, this was a project that began actually several decades ago. My dad was doing some research in Philadelphia, and he ran across an old edition of a cookbook by a Virginia woman named Mary Randolph. She was from a prominent Virginia family, well-connected. She's a cousin of Thomas Jefferson's, et cetera, et cetera. And she published in 1824 what is arguably the first truly American cookbook. And my dad bought a copy as a present for my mother, who collected cookbooks, and she was fascinated by it. She took these old recipes that said things like, take butter the size of an egg, and when the fire be ready, blah, blah, blah. And she translated this into modern measurements, ingredients, temperatures, etc. And my dad said, you have to publish this. And they had a publisher lined up, but he ended up going bankrupt. And the manuscript sat in a box until about 6 years ago, when my parents moved and I went up to North Carolina to help them. And I found the manuscript typed out on onion skin. And I was getting ready to go on a research leave working on another project. And I thought, well, I'm going to look into this. And so I researched the background of Mary Randolph, her book, which was called The Virginia Housewife, the history of cooking, the legacy of the cookbook, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was the result. I wrote the history of this and then presented it to my mother for a Christmas present. And
what did she say about this?
Oh, she broke into tears.
Aww.
It was one of my best presents. So we started shopping around for a publisher and offered it, worked through the Virginia Historical Society, who vetted the project, did peer review through it. And I thought, I'm a tenured professor. I don't really need another publication. So I offered it to the Historic Savannah Foundation and the Isaiah Davenport House, because I know that they use Mary Randolph and her cooking in their interpretations. So I thought, what a better way than to really make this truly public history. And so they loved the idea. We approached several publishers. A couple of academic pressers were excited about it, but they decided, no, let's go with a popular press. And we went with a division of Rowman and Littlefield, and really are trying to get this out to the public, because this isn't just a history of Southern cooking. It also has about a third of the original cookbook in it, with the original recipes, plus the new translations of them, so that people can actually be preparing historic food in their own homes.
Yeah, the recipes are fascinating. I thumbed through them and I really read like every single one of them. And you have basically the old recipe, a short description of how this kind of fits in the cookbook and in the world at that time, and the translation. And there were some of them that really kind of struck me as interesting kind of tidbits of the time.
Right.
So, for example, there is an asparagus soup in the book that just says, thicken with butter, milk, and flour, and that's it. There's
Right.
nothing in terms of how much you use and how you use it and what do you do. So I felt that that was an assumption of what women knew at the time. So do you feel that that's the case?
I think you're exactly right. Mary Randolph was preparing recipes for people who had, I think she felt, had basic knowledge. That, growing up in a household, you would be familiar with basic things like making a white sauce, which is what you were describing. And what my mom did was then to say, okay, how do you make a white sauce? How much flour? How much butter, etc., and putting these things together. But I think you're exactly right that Randolph is coming from a tradition where people have basic knowledge. And a lot of her recipes are like that. For example, she'll say in sometimes when the fire is ready. Well, how do you know when the fire is ready?
And it's not giving you a temperature either. It's like when the fire is ready, right. What is it? Yeah. And
exactly right.
But considering who she was a prominent woman in Virginia. I mean, they were connected to all of the political families at that point. How is it that she was a cook? Wouldn't she have had servants or slaves that would take care of that? Or, how would a woman of her standing know all of this?
Yes, well, it would be part of her education. A woman in aristocratic Virginia society was in charge of the household. And so in order to be able to supervise enslaved cooks, she herself would have to know these things. Plus, these recipes are coming down often from family, from friends. And as time went on, the Randolphs, it's kind of a Gothic Southern story. Her husband, David, was also they're all cousins. Virginians love to marry their cousins. And David and Thomas Jefferson are cousins. And so he got a job as a federal judge through Jefferson, who was at the time Secretary of State. Well, as political parties developed, David fell into the Federalist camp, while Tom, of course, is setting up this new political party. And when he became president, he fired his cousin as a federal judge. And that really left the family in bad financial straits. Plus, they spent money like it was nothing. They went through their fortune, basically. And when that happened, they sold their plantation. They sold several lots in Richmond. They had to sell their house. And along with that, they sold several enslaved people. So David ends up going to England to pursue some things, financial opportunities, and he's there for 7 or 8 years. But meanwhile, Mary is in Richmond.
She's left behind.
She's behind trying to raise their 4 boys. So she took the unexpected step of opening up a boarding house. And I think while she ran her boarding house in Richmond, she was actually much, much more hands-on than she would have been earlier in her life. And she gained quite a reputation as being the hostess of Richmond. She was dubbed Queen Molly by one of her friends.
So how common was that for a woman to have that kind of business?
It would have been very unusual for someone of her standing, but I think that personally shows 2 things. One, it shows her initiative, her gumption, that she is taking on this agency and these responsibilities and making it work. But also women frequently took over businesses when they became widows. It was not unusual if they were of lower standing, say craftsmen's wives or running small farms, that if their husbands died, then they would frequently take over the businesses themselves.
That's really interesting. What I also found interesting was that she used ingredients I would not have imagined at all for using in 1780s, 1790s, 1800s Virginia. Like, for example, she had recipes using curry and curry powder. She had recipes using all sorts of things like macaroni, oysters, and whatnot. And I wondered what you can tell it about those, because that shows extensive networks that sort of disappeared, I feel, later on.
That's quite possible. And the cultural origins of the food are fascinating. I mean, not surprisingly, the main thrust of this is English cooking. But on top of that, you have French dishes. You have, and that's coming in from, again, Jefferson is in France.
Francophile.
Exactly. So you've got the family exchanging recipes. You have things coming in from the Spanish Caribbean and from Latin America. You have the Italian stuff coming in. This cookbook has the first American recipe for macaroni and cheese.
That was a surprise to me.
Well, Thomas Jefferson actually served it at a state dinner in the White House.
I can hardly see that as a fancy dinner, but he apparently, you wrote in the book that he bought a macaroni machine.
Right. He just loved it. Apparently was introduced to it while he was in Europe, and just it came and took America by storm. The curry is a mystery. I mean, because you've got Native American influences, a lot of American food, squashes, things like that. You have African influences with okra and various other food products and techniques. But the curry, I can only imagine, came from the greater British Empire, the interconnectedness. You know, when you're looking at ceramics, I did archaeology when I was a graduate student, and you have ceramics coming from China, Japan, somewhat, but all over the world. And I am just assuming that Mary Randolph got her taste for curry from the same source, the Greater World Trade Network, which I think would really surprise people. Now, as for oysters, that's Native American, and it's a very Virginian thing.
There's a recipe in there where she stuffs a brisket with oysters.
Right.
And that was really surprising to me.
Oysters appear in a lot of the recipes. But yeah, the brisket one is a little unusual. It could be, one of the things that Randolph does in this is she uses everything. So she talks about once you've got an old chicken, who's stopped laying, how is the best way to prepare the old chicken, because it's going to be tough and stringy. So maybe it's possible that she's thinking, old brisket, it's not going to be that good. I know, let's spice it up a little bit. We'll add oysters to it. Virginians love oysters, so why not?
And I remember that recipe of the old chicken, and it was like, put it in the coop for 2 weeks and do this and this and that to feed it so that it's a little bit less bony, and that kind of leads me into another question where she's really economical. She's going to use leftovers into different recipes, and I wonder if that actually came from just being at the end of their money, or if it was something really common at the time where she was writing to housewives who probably were not as wealthy as she was.
I think it probably was the latter, the fact that it was very common at the time. People are often living on the margins, even wealthy people. And particularly in the wintertime, where you are eating things that have been stored in the spring, and towards the end of winter, things can run a little low. So you really don't want to waste anything, any part of it. One of the recipes we left out of this was how to make gelatin from horse hooves. That sort of thing. And so, you've got an old horse. You're gonna use the hooves, the kind of thing.
It's sad, but it's something that was done at the time. Would they have eaten the horse meat though? Was that still taboo or?
No, not in America. Not to my knowledge.
I don't know if that was because I know that it's eaten in European countries, like France. It's still eaten somewhere in the Nordic countries as well. I just didn't know if that was the case in America or not.
Yeah, I haven't run across that here.
We were talking about the networks, the connection between the different networks earlier. The only country I haven't seen any kind of connection that was part of the larger networks was anything Asian. So there is no real, the only connection that you make in the book was about ketchup.
Right.
So the different brines and ketchups that were probably from the Asian continent. So I was wondering if you had anything about that.
I really don't know why. I was surprised. You do have rice and rice being served as accompaniment, but I think that is coming from the African tradition. Rather, again, to show the African American connections to this cookbook. But no, there doesn't seem to be that. The only Asian thing you really have is the South Asian with that bit of curry.
Okay. One other section in the book that was really interesting was all of the desserts and all types of desserts that were there. And that left me on my appetite. And I was like, oh my God, I need to make all of these.
This is the best mincemeat recipe in the world. I
have no doubts about that. That just made me drool reading it. And I mean, one of the biggest feature in this is a risen cake. And I mean, I wanted you to talk a little bit about this because I have a feeling that this cake was meant to be eaten by 100 people.
Easily.
The quantity of food in it.
Absolutely. She had, if I remember correctly, she has like 9 pounds of dried fruit in this thing. You're exactly right. Remember, she is a hostess and she is running a boarding house.
Yeah.
And so I think you're exactly right. And that was one of the things that my mom did when she originally went through and looked at these recipes was that, okay, obviously Randolph is cooking for 30. How can we do this for a family of 5?
Because it's not exactly economical for us to make recipes for 30 these days.
Once you have a really big freezer.
Yeah, and again, and that actually brings me to the feature of the book, which is when she has those blueprints for the water heater and for a refrigerator, which we're talking about days without electricity here.
Right. This was in the second edition, which came out a year or two later after the original one. She includes illustrations in it. And her husband, David, may have had a role in this. But one of the things that she does include is this basic design for a refrigerator. And it's the basic design that was used until electricity came along and was modified. It's similar to others that were done around the same time.
So can you describe it a little bit? Can you describe her apparatus and how she's thinking of it?
It basically is a really well insulated barrel of sorts, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the details because I was looking more at the first edition rather than the second. So,
but it has kind of a column of ice in the middle, so it's an ice box basically, with the middle that has like ice, and then she would just change. How do you get ice in the summer?
It was stored.
Okay.
It was harvested in the 17th century and early 18th century during the mini ice age. Virginia was really cold. There are accounts of 6-foot snowdrifts at Jamestown. They would harvest the ice. They would cut ice out of frozen lakes, and then they would store it in underground cellars insulated using sawdust. And later, later they began importing ice. Once things started warming up again, they imported it from Massachusetts, from Vermont, from various northern colonies and states. But again, it was stored. But at a certain point in the summer, you're going to run out. So,
because I have a hard time imagining how it would look like to get ice in the 90-degree Virginia. No matter how hard you try, it's going to melt.
Exactly. But at the governor's palace in Williamsburg, you can still see the ice house. It is underneath a giant mound, and essentially it's like a well, which they used a pulley system to bring the blocks of ice out when they wanted. And people frequently comment, at least in June, how the governor is serving iced drinks or parfait or thing. So it's obviously a status symbol.
Yeah, it's a treat. I mean, having a cold drink in the summer, it's something really special. And the water heater was also the same thing, like with a bath with kind of a furnace in it that you would have hot water, because that's also one of the tasks that took the longest was to boil water.
Hauling water. Yeah, it would have been a pain to go from the fire up 2 floors. So yes, this was the design for a bathtub, and she has basically like a little wood heater that submerges in the water, and she has it designed so that it will still be able to work. Little smokestacks that come out through the bathwater.
That was really cute. Do you know if the other editions had anything about how to set up a table, or more prescriptive kind of literature where women could learn about, how to set like your placemats and your plates and everything else that you needed on the table?
Yeah, from the very beginning, Randolph puts in helpful advice about how not only to prepare food, but how to preserve it, how to serve it, what to choose for meals. She in one very famous section tells people that you really shouldn't overwhelm your guests, that a few well-made items is much better than trying to just load your table down with things. Again, in the second edition, when she includes illustrations, she also has illustrations for place sittings for various courses. And I included a couple of those in the book.
That's fascinating, because also you can imagine how the family would sit down and what they would have around them and how they would eat. So it kind of gives you an image of what happened at the table in the Virginia family at that time.
And how you would entertain on special occasions.
Exactly. Which, do you know if there were several celebrations in a year? What were kind of the major holidays at that time?
The same that there are now. The big entertaining season in Virginia would have been the fall. So from the fall through Christmas, essentially. So you've got those holidays. During the colonial period, you have special events like the King's birthday, that sort of thing. They mark successful battles. If there's a cause for a celebration, they're going to have it. And that gets carried over on when the United States is born.
Mm-hmm, of course. So one of the last questions I had was, I was kind of skeptical that she wouldn't have any recipes for alcohol in her book.
Actually did. She did in the original edition. We just decided that we would focus on we only included about a third of the original recipes, but she has recipes for various wines. There's one that I think that's made out of spruce. The tree.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sort of a spruce beer or something like that? Or?
Yeah. And I don't think my mom ever worked into those.
It's
I think she's more interested in the main courses. Right.
So how did you go about researching this book? because you have to basically throw yourself at so many things at the same time. How did you do it?
Yeah, this project was different from anything I have ever done before. I do specialize in Virginia history, southeastern colonial history. So I had a background in Virginia. But what I did was I took my mom's manuscript, those recipes, and then I just went to town. I spent a lot of time at various Virginia repositories, a lot of time at Colonial Williamsburg, various other places in Richmond, a few places in North Carolina, which have good culinary history collections, and began just tracing the Randolphs, tracing the history of cookbooks. That was fascinating. And then various other things. And this result it's a combination of the history of Southern culture. It's a history of foodways. It moves into women's history. This is the best footnoted cookbook you are ever going to have.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, the research is extensive, and it really gives us a glimpse of what life was at that time. And I think it's really important. What do you think people will think of the cookbook? Do you feel that it's an accessible cookbook that anybody can use? Do you feel it's going to appeal more to historians? Where do you see it fitting?
I'm hoping that it's going to appeal to a wide audience. It's going to appeal to people who are interested in culinary history, who are interested in Southern history. But on the other hand, it should appeal to somebody who is just looking for something to cook while under quarantine. These are going to be somewhat unusual dishes in many respects, but I have personally made about 80% of the recipes in the book, and I have yet to find one I didn't like.
Yeah, they look very easy to make, all things considered, but they look very easy to make and accessible. And except for that brisket with the oysters, I have to say they all appeal to me, and I think I will really try them all overall. So you have
every once in a while.
Go for it.
I was going to say, every once in a while you run into an ingredient that might be kind of hard to find. For example, Randolph uses ground mace a lot. But fortunately, here in Savannah, we've got a sort of a specialty food store. They had it, and the internet is wonderful. I had to find all for a terrific tart, that recipe that she used, and that came a couple of days.
That's wonderful. The internet has saved us in so many ways. So you have several events coming up for the book. I saw that you have one at the Davenport House, where you're going to do a cooking demonstration as well. Right.
We had a number of events scheduled here in town that actually were supposed to take place this week, but of course with the pandemic, those have all been canceled. So instead, towards Memorial Day, we're going to be moving some events online. And one of them, they've asked me to do a cooking demonstration while I'm talking about the book. So that'll be coming from my kitchen downstairs. And then
so which recipe have you chosen?
I haven't yet, so we're going to be talking about that. It'd probably be a dessert because those are fun.
Oh yeah, they are.
And then this summer and in the fall, we've got some events scheduled here in town. We're going to be doing a delayed launch, probably the first week in November.
Perfect. That's just in time for Thanksgiving, and she has many recipes for turkey in there. So if you want to change up your plans, that's the perfect occasion.
This year, every recipe we served at Thanksgiving was from the cookbook, from the appetizer to the dessert.
How did that go?
It was amazing, if I do say so myself. Everything was delicious.
I hope that if Mary Randolph was still alive today, she would be proud of us for cooking all of her recipes.
She would. One of the reasons why I think she put this together, this basically was her retirement project.
Yeah.
When David got back from England, they spent a few more years in Richmond, but then they retired to Washington, where they had a son living. And part of the tradition out of which this cookbook grew was mothers passing on recipes that they stitched together in books to their daughters. Well, she only had 4 sons who lived to adulthood. And I think partly one of the reasons that she did this was to be able to carry on that tradition, to share her knowledge with other cooks.
And you were saying that Martha Washington had received one of those cookbooks, and it was a big folio
from
kind
her
of
mother-in-law. Yes. Yeah. She got it from her first mother-in-law, and there are 2 of these bound cookbooks that pass through the Randolph family as well.
That's wonderful. Well, I hope that this is going to be kind of part of her legacy again, and that is going to appeal to many more cooks who today might not know who she is, might not have access to her food, but will still taste a little bit of that old Virginia, like in their own kitchen today. So thank you very much for speaking with me today. It's a pleasure, and I will update you on my amazing results, I am sure. Thank you.
Well, good luck. Let me know if you need any advice.
Oh, I will. Thank you very much.